Hello, my name is Dragan, and this presentation focuses on Plan B 4.0 textbook by Lester Brown. This particular presentation actually focuses on Chapter 6, and I will be doing the second half of this chapter. My partner Kyle DiMaggio worked on the Part 1 of this chapter. The outline for the chapter actually includes quite a few things, and I'm covering 4 sections of it. One is refers to reducing urban water use. Second one talks about farming in the city. Third one is upgrading squatter settlements. And the fourth one is cities for people. In addition to that, this chapter shows a lot of simple moves that we can provide in a design to have dramatic effects on the environment. Chapter also provides multiple examples of how cities can improve by incorporating some of the concepts that are in this text, in this chapter. And then it also talks about health and safety in city design. One thing that we both noticed, Kyle and I, that this book was copyrighted in 2009. It is getting a little dated, and a lot of the suggestions that they've made in this text have been around for quite some time. So unfortunately, not a lot of new material was proposed in this text. Chapter number 6, the first portion that I'll be covering starts on page 154, and it talks about reducing urban waste, urban water use. And in particular, what the author is suggesting is the use of a composting toilet. And he begins to discuss the use of water, filtered water, drinkable water, in order to get rid of human waste out of toilets. And also the usage of water for showering. Both of those added up account for more than half of household water usage. The section mostly focuses on, again, using composting toilets, and the question that it starts with is, have you ever thought about what happens when you actually flush a toilet? The image below that you see here shows a sewage treatment plant. Most cities in North America have, with its multiple stages. So again, once you do flush your toilet, this is where it typically ends up, and this is where it gets treated prior to being re-released without the sediment into our rivers, streams, and unfortunately, if you've ever actually had the bad experience of driving, walking, or even riding your bike beside one of these treatment facilities on a hot summery day, you're going to know that you are in vicinity of one of these. It certainly does not smell very good. In addition to the terrible smells, you can only imagine the cost of running and building such a facility, as well as the entire sewer system. So from each and every house that has to bring the sewage from the city to this location, the expenses to build and maintain such a system. So, in addition to that, I'm from Toronto, Ontario, and one of the issues with an aging city that we have here is the fact that a lot of our sewers are out of date. They're falling apart. And one of the really bad things that happens in this city is the fact that a lot of our storm and sewage lines are combined below ground, as you can see on this image on the left side. Most modern cities have a separate sewer system, like the image in the middle. And then the image on the right is a map of the city of Toronto that shows you some of the worst places where, when we have a storm, a strong enough rain, it actually overflows into the sewer lines, and unfortunately we have sewage that ends up directly into Lake Ontario and into the Toronto harbor. Hence why nobody swims after a heavy rainfall in Lake Ontario, in the vicinity here. So that is obviously a huge, very expensive issue for the city to deal with. They simply don't have the money to rebuild a lot of the infrastructure below ground, to update it to separate systems. And that's one of the big we have. Brown, the author, argues that the typical toilet basically uses clean filtered water, drinkable water, to get rid of human waste. The costs, like I said, are extremely large for municipalities. Never mind the actual installation of the sewers, but also maintenance over years as these things start to fall apart and degrade. Basically, he calls it a mindless and outdated approach. This is directly from the author. He's basically saying that flushing away our problems is simply not going to work for a long period of time. So current engineering deals with the concept of human waste by using vast quantities of water to wash it away into a sewer. So it calls it a flush and forget system. Now, the other issue with this is not just the expense that I've talked about, but he also mentions getting rid of nutrients from agriculture. So instead of all of these nutrients from the sewage ending up on farms and in order for us to use it towards growing food, the nutrients are just washed away, and in fact they pollute our rivers and our lakes. And in fact, he talks about some of the dead zones in the oceans in the coastal regions. So this outdated system simply will not work for a long period of time. So this graphic describes the two systems and the complexity. So you're talking about the composting toilet in the top image with that sewage ending up basically in the gardens of the farms, or even your own backyard garden, compared to the conventional sewage system with fertilizer production. As you can see, it's a much more difficult, complicated system that includes all kinds of pollutions at all kinds of levels. Everything from the electricity required to produce the fertilizer and so on, and all the treatments with chlorine at the water treatment plant, and all the trucks being used to actually produce the fertilizer, then eventually gets pumped out onto the farms. And then every time it rains, we also know that a lot of those nitrates end up in our rivers, streams, and that causes all kinds of havoc to the ecological system, where we have basically dead zones in our lakes and rivers because of it. The next slide talks about the solution. Okay, so as per the author, he basically talks about this low-cost alternative, a composting toilet, which is really a simple device. Basically, it looks very similar to the toilet that everybody has in their homes, but instead of using water to flush away the problems, the composting toilet actually takes that human fecal material, turns it into humus, which is essentially odorless, and he does say that eventually turns into 10% of its original volume. It is typically stored, like you see in the graphic here. It is properly sealed, ventilated, and so on, so there are no issues from that perspective within the house itself. Brown lists the following is the benefits of composting toilets. So it sharply reduces the residential water use. So just by replacing all your toilets in the house, you're going to eliminate something like 40% of your fresh water usage. It has been used on larger scales in some Swedish apartment buildings, US private residences, and even Chinese villages. So flush and forget system is an energy guzzler, he calls it, and the energy to deliver the drinking quality water to toilets is expensive. So the question I had is, if they are so great, as you can see them in this right image here, you can see that they basically look like a large toilet. If they are so great, how come they're not in every home? They basically require very little water, or almost no water to run. Huge savings, or nice savings for the homeowner from that perspective. From this website, motherearthliving.com, Annie Bond, the author, talks about how when this product came along in the first place, most of the places that it was utilized was in hippie campgrounds, as she called them, in underdeveloped countries. But recently, even in British Columbia and Canada, a building of 30,000 square feet office complex at the university was actually equipped with these. So hopefully they'll start to take place and the technology will get better and easier. Composting toilets are well ventilated containers. Human waste gets stored in the bottom. Natural bacteria and fungi basically break down the waste, and that's what turns it into 10 to 30% of its original volume. So though again, being a practical person, I was asking as to who gets to do the cleanup, and this is kind of how it looks in section, and this is what the end product looks like. Basically a tray that you would collect. It looks like dry hummus that you can take and you can spread it on your garden, which is, I suppose, an interesting job. Regardless of what type of composting toilet you choose, there's a couple different types. There's one that is a self-contained unit that you saw earlier, or you can actually connect it to, for example, in the basement, have it in bins, and then those bins can get rolled out of your house. Fully decomposed hummus possesses little risk to handlers. Depending on local laws, you can actually use it in your own backyard, or you can get a professional to clean this out. So not only is there savings on the water bill, but you also don't have to buy fertilizer. And yes, I don't think I would want this job. Perhaps I'll ask one of my teenagers to do this. I doubt it, right? Okay, the next suggestion made by the author is farming in the city, so that's on page 158. When I was in Detroit, actually last year, at the Woodward campus, downtown Detroit, I noticed a lot of the empty lots were converted into food-producing neighborhood gardens, and Brown does not get into the details behind such conversions, what makes it successful, so I found his description of it very brief. He does quote E.O. Wilson, which I thought was interesting, and talks about the biophilia hypothesis, argues that those who are deprived of contact with nature suffer psychologically, and that's one of the problems with living in a concrete jungle in a big city where there's very little nature around. And if you've ever gardened, you know, and you've enjoyed it, you know the reasons behind it is that you are outside, you are in the fresh air, and you know, from a daily perspective, you get to see something that you planted grow into something that actually produces a nutritious and a healthy food source. So from a city perspective, there's other benefits to it. From a social perspective, as you can see, this is a large group of people that have gathered together, and obviously there's going to be benefits to that, working together and sharing ideas and some of the examples of urban farming from around the world that I found, again, this is sort of outside of the text. In a lot of countries, this is a very common thing. I talked about cities like Dar es Salaam, capital of Tanzania, so some 650 hectares of land around the cities produce. Vietnam is a very, well, they call it a star example. Hanoi, 80% of fresh vegetables come from the farms immediately adjacent to the city, and I found that a stunning number. Obviously, Vietnam has a more tropical climate, and they're able to do this. In a country like Canada, I thought, you know, obviously we have very similar climate to Detroit and Michigan, and we wouldn't be able to run gardens year-round unless they are in some type of a glass enclosure. But I just found that number astonishing, and a lot of our vegetables during the winter, fruits and vegetables, do come from places like South America and Mexico, which obviously has its own implications with a very large footprint, trucks, planes, boats delivering this food source to us at great distances, causing all kinds of harm to the environment. Farms in the city or its shadows also produce 50% of the pork and poultry. This is back to Vietnam, consumed there. So everything's sort of very tightly knit, very close. So if you have a large population, obviously you've got to feed it having those systems close by makes a lot of sense. Half of the city's freshwater fish are produced by enterprising urban fish farmers, and 40% of the egg supply is produced within the city or nearby. And I, again, compare that to a city like Mississauga near Toronto here in Ontario, where there's an actual bylaw banning, and we're sort of fighting to allow to have up to, let's say, 5 chickens in your backyard in a coop. There's an actual ban on that in the city, which is very frustrating because you're allowed to have pet snakes in your house, but you're not allowed to have, a few chickens in your backyard that are within a, coop enclosure with all kinds of benefits there. Urban farmers, going back to the slide, ingeniously recycle human and animal waste. So these are photos from Hanoi in Vietnam. And basically, it's what we talked about a little bit earlier with the composting toilets. So a similar idea where you get to use that human and animal waste in order to produce food. Other examples around the world, Caracas, Venezuela, there's a government-sponsored micro garden. 1 square meter is not a big space, but if you've ever gardened, you would see something like they would be about the size of this table that you see in the image, and it's created about 8,000 of these gardens throughout the city. So obviously, these are very quick crops. There would be salads, lettuce, and things like that. And if again, the climate in Venezuela is going to be very tropical, so you'll be able to grow this year-round pretty much. And again, they can produce, one little garden like this can produce 330 heads of lettuce, 18 kilograms of tomatoes, or 16 kilograms of cabbage. So those are pretty significant numbers for such a small land. The one thing that I did find, again, North America, so United States and Canada, this opportunity seems to be getting missed, in the States alone. Some of the numbers, obviously, over 330 million people living there. City of Chicago has 70,000 vacant lots. Philadelphia, 31,000. So with those numbers, the benefits would be significant. If this type of farming in the city idea started to spread, more fresh produce would be available. Potentially, maybe some of the food banks could gain from that. And so on. So millions would discover the social benefit, psychological benefit, as E.O. Wilson talked about, of being in a natural urban garden type of a setting. Next section talks about upgrading squatter settlements, and honestly, I found this title actually kind of confusing because it sounds like the author is suggesting that we need to support and help out people who are literally breaking the law. But what Brown does is he explains that the squatters are not really choosing to live in a settlement such as this. And as you see in the photos, this is not exactly a kind of place that most of us would want to live in. And he does talk about settlements in, I would suggest, well, maybe if not third world countries, but in countries that are a lot worse off economically than North American countries. Brown explains the squatters are forced into it, and because of their situation, out of sheer necessity, millions live in this type of squalor. So he's suggesting the cities need to treat the cause of the settlements, not the symptom. A lot of places like this around the world, politicians simply want to bulldozer over these areas. But you're not going to solve that problem. You're going to basically make a lot of these very poor people move to another location and they have to live somewhere. So Brown suggests that providing water to these communities, for example, a proper water system, will help with disease issues. If people can, wash and bathe. Also suggests the government provide microloans to help people improve these scenarios where they're living. To me, both of these suggestions encourage squatters to stay, in fact, expand. I think the best suggestion Brown makes towards this is the actual decrease in this type of settlement is that the industries don't focus themselves. So when they set up factories and shops and offices, that they don't set up in major centers. but spread out into the countryside. So that would allow people not to have to pack themselves into these massive urban centers, but they could potentially move to smaller centers where housing costs would be much more affordable. Again, we have a Canadian example of that. So in the corridor from Windsor, on the other side of Detroit, all the way to Toronto, about a 4-hour drive, if you will. It makes a lot more sense for industry to spread out along that major highway route, so people don't all have to move to a major center like Toronto, where house prices are, well, insane. Cities for People is the final section in chapter 6, and here the author deals with the actual design of the cities, and he gets into the details of trying to convert or starting to convert some of the very dense urban centers in a lot of ways. So there'll be some pretty striking renderings like the one that you see here, where parts of New York City were completely converted. So roads were completely converted into park-like settings, again, built for people, not for vehicles. The biggest issue that we always see is that comparison between North America and Europe. And one example I found is that Atlanta, 95% of the people drive, which is just stunning. Paris, Amsterdam, less than half. The rest of the people, they ride, they walk, they take public transit. And the biggest issue that we have in North America is the sprawl, right? Our streets are too wide, everything is too far apart. In order for you to ride to work, you would have to fight heavy-duty traffic, polluted air, and pretty much risk your life to get yourself to work. So those systems are not in place. What North America badly requires is not car-free zones in the cities, although I think it's a good idea, but we need to make it difficult for vehicles. We need to start charging for highway usage. We need to start building mass transportation systems such as subways, light rail train systems, and anything else that can incentivize people to get out of their cars and start using this mass transport. Producing electric hybrid vehicles will also improve air quality in the cities, and I think in 2017 we saw that flip from where companies are actually going to eliminate production of the internal combustion engine, and I can't wait for that day. The death of the internal combustion engine is probably not that far from here. The next one, this slide here talks about the most dramatic suggestion for a more livable city came from Terraform, a design studio, and where he actually, or this firm talks about converting streets into parks, farms, and gardens. So basically, bringing the city back to nature. As you can see in this image, there are no vehicles except for the mass transport, light rail type of a suggestion, people walking everywhere, and obviously the urban density getting a lot denser. Obviously the incorporation of green roofs, the farmlands in the far distance not being that far away. So it's a very holistic view towards the future, describing parking lots turning into playgrounds. But at the same time, it's a fantastic scenario. I would love to live in a city like this, but we are decades, if not centuries, from cities like this. And converting our existing North American cities into these type of utopian spaces will take a lot of time and a lot. In conclusion for this chapter, basically author suggesting replacement of flushing toilets with composting. He talks about urban farming and all of the benefits of less pollution, fresher food, improved community, and then assisting the very poor in the development of very affordable housing, which I think is the solution. And finally, creating livable cities that create healthy environments for its citizens while utilizing minimal energy and creating minimal pollution. Like I said in the beginning, none of these suggestions are anything new to the environmental design community. Biggest obstacle typically lies in the funding and zoning and bylaw changes. Also, the introduction of transportation and infrastructural systems is extremely expensive to do something like this. But basically what I think needs to happen for the tipping point to take place is city leaders need to be convinced of the benefits, of the savings that the communities will see, and just how much better we will all live. And finally, the North American model of sprawled massive homes, it really does need to be heavily restricted, taxed very heavily in order for us to start to build on a much tighter, smaller scale, and have an environment that, a positive environment for our future generations. Thank you for listening. Again, my name is Dragan Acimovic, and I appreciate you listening to this presentation. Thank you.